Today, Matt Hancock's handling of the pandemic. The children addicted to vaping. And is the housing crisis about to get worse? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Housing Secretary Simon Clarke, Labour MP Dame Margaret Hodge, host of Politico's Westminster Insider podcast, Alva Ray, and The Telegraph's Camilla Tominey. On the programme.
Right from the start, it's been clear that this horrible virus affects older people most. So right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
Do a cache of WhatsApp messages put that claim in doubt? Allies defend Matt Hancock's handling of the pandemic.
It was absolutely crystal clear that we wanted to test everyone who went into social care. That was the ambition.
Rishi Sunak has Prime Minister's questions at noon. How will his new Brexit deal go down with MPs? We'll get the judgment of this former Cabinet Minister and Brexiteer.
Marketing vaping, an addictive product with unknown consequences for developing minds, to children is utterly unacceptable.
This deputy head teacher will tell us about the impact of vaping in his school. Let's start with this story. Headline in BBC News: cut parents' benefits over school truancy, suggests Michael Gove. This was an interview Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, gave to the think tank Onward. It was something he said he thought about during the coalition years, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. He said it was blocked by the Liberal Democrats. And it's about docking the benefits of parents who fail to ensure their children get to school. A good idea or not?
Good idea, yes. I think absolutely that parents need to take responsibility for their children. I think we obviously all believe that attendance is vital, and this is obviously one of a range of measures which you could take to try and make sure that attendance is as strong as it can be. And there are positive levers, which you should obviously always deploy first, and I've seen, for example, a fantastic turnaround at a school like Freeburgh Academy in my constituency, which has gone from inadequate to outstanding in the last 5 years, and that's been achieved largely through very positive encouragements to children.
Well, then why use this?
But I think if you have persistent truanting and the family are not engaging, then Michael is right to say that you may want to look at options which sharpen the incentives.
Margaret?
Well, we're going to have disagreement on the programme today, so you'll be pleased to hear it. I think it's an absolutely appalling idea. It's a political gimmick, if I can say to you, Simon, rather than a serious attempt at dealing with a very difficult problem. Let's first of all look at it. It is a huge problem. It's got worse since COVID, when children have fallen out of the habit of going to school, and it affects those most vulnerable children the most. If you look at free school meal figures as one thing, it tends to be kids on free school meals who don't go. So, of course, you've got to tackle it, but let's tackle it in a sensible way. Let's understand why it's happening. And I think there are various things that, if we hadn't had the cuts to schools, I'm sorry to say that to you, we would have had more staff in schools who could do the sensible things. Ring the parents immediately when a child doesn't come in, go and do a home visit, all those things that get a better relationship. And I may also say to you, if you hadn't cut Sure Start, we'd have had a really good programme which would have got us talking to parents at a very early stage and telling them about the importance of education. Punishing parents rather than dealing with the problems is just cheap politics.
I'm afraid, Margaret, kids' education is too important for us to just turn a blind eye to persistent truanting. And I completely agree. I think schools do a lot to try and engage with parents and families. And I think that is absolutely what I see in my patch. But there are families who, let's be clear, don't think this is a priority, don't take it seriously, and with the best will in the world, sometimes you just need to be tough with people who won't engage.
Let's deal with the facts. It is massive. It's a massive problem. It's almost 1 in 5 children will not be attending school at some point. There will always be some parents who you need to take firm action on.
Yes,
I think
this is the point.
Tiny proportion.
And I don't think Michael's suggesting anything otherwise. That's the point.
He is. Right? What's he going to do about the 20%? If he wants to tackle the 20%, it's putting the resources resources into a school so that you can do that relationship with parents, so that you can work with the parents to bring the child into school. And it's all those teaching assistants that we used to have in schools that were really doing that sort of job, they've gone with the cuts.
Do you think it will work? Well, do you think it would work?
Well, I think this is clearly a very complicated problem. When you think of the myriad reasons why children might not attend school, they could be being bullied, they might, not be very confident in their academic performance, they might have quite serious mental health difficulties, really like entrenched problems at home. I think that there's a risk with this that it could do more harm than good, which should be, the absolute priority of politicians. If even if you can't tackle this, don't make it worse. I think in a cost of living crisis, proposing to slash benefits is a little bit tricky. Would it actually work? I mean, if a student is bunking off school because they're being bullied, or I don't really know if their parent being fined would really tackle that problem.
I mean, is that the problem? That it wouldn't have the desired effect, and it would at the same time punish the families?
I mean, I think there is a cohort of children and their parents don't care whether they're in school or not, and that's desperately sad. There should be no higher priority for a government than educating the nation's children. I think there's a bigger issue here, and I remember it coming up during the pandemic and the Centre for Social Justice doing some work on it, that there wasn't enough centralised record keeping on how many children are attending school. There was a so-called 100,000 lost children of lockdown. These were ghost children who came off the registered and the government simply couldn't find them and didn't know what happened to them. So I think Robert Halfron, the chair of the Education Select Committee, has raised this, that actually parents like me, we get a lot of letters regularly from the headmaster talking about absenteeism and how important it is to keep that rate up in the high 90s. But I think there is a problem with an overall macro knowledge of where some children are. And if they're not at school, where on earth are they, and why aren't they being traced?
There's a real glaring problem with that headline, which is assuming that all of the parents of all the children who aren't in school are on benefits. I mean, what's the penalty for parents who aren't on benefits, whose children aren't attending school? I'm sure that, we know that a lot of vulnerable children are in this category, but for those who aren't, why is it just a policy for parents on benefits?
Well, that's a good point. To move on, let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph, Camilla's paper, The Lockdown Files. It's called 100,000 Leaked WhatsApp Messages Revealed. Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, rejected Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England, Whitty's advice on care home tests. Now, this story has emerged because the 100,000 WhatsApp messages have been passed to the Telegraph by the journalist Isabel Oakeshott. She's been critical of the government's handling of the pandemic. She was given copies of all of these WhatsApp messages while she was helping Matt Hancock write his book, The Pandemic Diaries. She's now decided to release them all to the Telegraph. This is a statement from Matt Hancock. These stolen messages, or his spokesperson, have been doctored to create a false story that Matt rejected clinical advice on care home testing. This is flat wrong. Let's give you a flavour of some of the core messages that have been published in the paper. The BBC hasn't seen or independently verified them, but this are a selection of those messages. Matt Hancock. You can see the date there and the time. It's in the morning. Chris Whitty has done an evidence review and now recommends testing of all going into care homes and segregation whilst awaiting result. This is obviously a good, positive step, and we must put into the document. There is this, then, response message from Special Advisor Alan Nixon. I wasn't in testing meeting. Just to check, officials are saying your steer is to remove the commitment to testing on admission to care homes from the community, but keep commitment to testing on admission to care homes from hospital. Is that right? And then later on that day, fine. Matt Hancock message. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I would rather leave it out and just commit to test and isolate all going into care from hospital. I do not think the community commitment adds anything and it muddies the water. Have that for a Q&A response. Well, Junior Health Minister at the time and colleague of Matt Hancock, Lord Bethell, was interviewed about this story and about those messages. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
At that stage, it was clear to everyone that we wanted to move to a situation where many, many more people were tested in the country, particularly those who were most vulnerable, like those going into social care. But we were only doing a few thousand tests a day. And that was the practical problem. We were trying, like every other country in the world, like every other health system, we were desperately trying to scale our testing to meet this huge need for extra tests. And what we had to try to do in the meantime was to prioritise who got tested first.
Lord Bethel's right, isn't he, Camilla, that this is a partial story, that the Telegraph has these WhatsApp messages. It doesn't include all the notes from the meetings, the official meetings that were held.
And we've never made any secret of that. You know, this is one conversation at an unprecedented time. However, we are baffled at the notion of us doctoring messages. Nothing's been doctored, and indeed the section that he refers to as being missing is actually there and has been there in full from the beginning. So what we've done is we have poured through 2.3 million words and we are presenting the messages as verbatim. We very much believe it's in the public interest for the public to know the decision-making in the background that informed decisions that changed people's lives and affected people's lives. This was a life and death situation. On care homes, I've got a personal vested interest because my father, a retired GP, has run a care home for many, many years. And he wrote for the Telegraph in September 2020, pointing out the fiasco that the testing regime had become. He talked to me very early on in the pandemic how he didn't feel a protective ring had been thrown around care homes. On the contrary, they didn't have enough PPE. They had huge staff absences, up to 50% at one point, according to a survey by the National Care Forum. And that diktat of April the 2nd, which suggested that people should be released into care homes to free up beds in hospitals without being tested, was disastrous. What these messages then say is that instead of mandating, as Professor Whitty had requested, for all people admitted to care homes to be tested. In fact, the guidance of April the 15th said that only those who were coming from the hospital setting should be tested and not those from the community.
Right.
Matt Hancock then later tells the Health and Social Care Committee months later that actually it was community transmission that really proved fatal for care homes, where, lest we forget, 25,000 people died in the first 3 months of the pandemic.
Right. As you know, Lord Bethel also said, James Bethel, that it was operationally impossible to test everybody because there weren't enough tests. Simon, what is your response to the story?
Well, I think what this shows is the importance of the COVID inquiry that will examine the full set of information, which, you know, as we all know, is going to be a mammoth undertaking, reflecting both messages such as these, but also all the government documents pertaining to what happened. I think most people recognise that the discharge of people into the care sector from hospitals and the wider challenges of the care home sector in those early months before mass testing was available was a major contributor to the number of people who died. And I think that is an accepted fact. The degree of culpability that can be ascribed to that is, I think, one which only really the committee can examine fairly, because I do think what Jim Bethel has said is right this morning. We do have to contextualise this, that we just did not have that testing capability in March,
and let me just go back to it, because
2020.
the WhatsApp message that I read, Camilla, Alan Nixon says, I wasn't in that testing meeting. That is where Matt Hancock's spokesperson has said that's where decisions were made. That's no doubt why he's pointing, or they are pointing to only a partial story, because that is where it was revealed they just didn't have the tests to do both people coming from the community into care homes, but also people in the hospital. Do you accept that?
We can accept that, of course, but what we also can't quite accept in light of what we now know from these messages is Mr Hancock having said on 3 separate occasions very early in the pandemic. He later said on Andrew Marr, he said it later, but he didn't say it. He said 3 times in the first wave of the pandemic that the government had thrown a protective ring around care homes. And actually what these messages relay, and what the anecdotal evidence of many care providers suggests, is that actually far from a protective ring being thrown around care homes, that actually the most vulnerable people in this pandemic, the elderly, were somewhat cast adrift.
What's your response, Margaret, listening to... I mean, do you think it is in the public interest to publish all these WhatsApp messages that will be handed over to the COVID inquiry?
Yes, I do think it's in the public interest. And I have always had this little rule in my head that if you put anything on paper, you've got to expect it to appear on the headline on The Sun, or indeed in this occasion on the Telegraph. You know, I don't know whether he chose to share these WhatsApps with Isabel Oakeshott. I should have expected that. There were a number of things I feel. It was terrible at the time, and I remember doing surveys of care homes in my own constituency, and the lack of testing and having all these people admitted, taken out of hospitals and admitted, was terrible. The lack of PPE was all terrible. Had they prioritised testing, that's what I always feel, and we'll wait for the inquiry, but had they prioritised testing, we could have performed better than as many of the other countries were doing on that. We were hopelessly behind everybody else on testing. And I think, I have to say, I've found some stuff on Twitter. Am I allowed to read this out to you?
Well, it depends what it is, Margaret.
You can find a lot on Twitter.
I've got a lot on Twitter from Matt Hancock having a discussion with George Osborne. He wanted George Osborne to cover for him. This was
these are other WhatsApp messages.
These are WhatsApp messages. 28th of April, he says, I need to call in a favour. I currently have 22,000 spare slots tomorrow at my drive-through. Hence, I've extended eligibility. Demand just isn't there. There's obviously good news about spread of virus, but hard for my target. And then he goes on. At one point, Osborne has clearly been a little bit critical of the testing regime, and Matt Hancock says why. Matt Hancock says, mass testing is going well. I fear this looks like you asked for me to be overruled. Osborne replies, no one thinks testing is going well. If I wanted to test today, I can't get one unless I fake systems.
All right.
And X is waiting test results from 3 weeks ago.
All right.
So
well,
it was
that
a complete. I think
we have
to give some balance here, and look, I accept completely, Margaret. Testing in those early months was extremely limited in our ability to offer it to everybody, and that was why it was such an achievement. Why we did ramp it up in the way that we did, and it's also, in fairness to the government, such
so was it a mistake to say you put a protective ring around care homes?
No, I think it just has to be understood in the context that if it is a case that there weren't enough tests, and I think that will have been the case, to test everybody going into the care homes, it wasn't completely unreasonable, I would submit, to say that people coming from hospital were a priority. I mean, that is,
yeah, but the guidance didn't change, Simon, until August, when it recommended that all people should be tested coming from the community. That was August. So by that point, of course, testing had been rightfully prioritised to the care sector. But you've also got the Health Secretary himself admitting later that it was community transmission that was the problem. We had a situation in care homes where people didn't get their test results back in time. Even in September of 2020, they were asymptomatic and therefore they were unwittingly spreading it around the residents and staff. That was 2020 September. That was 6 months into the pandemic.
I mean, just to take a step back, Alva, we've already had Matt Hancock's account, if you like, in the pandemic diaries. We now have this tranche of WhatsApp messages that actually Isabel Oakeshott published. She says in her defence that actually it was taking too long, waiting for the inquiry that has yet to come. Everybody getting their tail in first, if you like. I mean, do you take that statement from Isabel Oakeshott that actually we are behind other countries in terms of having actually held a public inquiry into the government's handling on COVID?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, lots of countries have already begun and finished their COVID inquiries. We haven't begun ours yet, or it's only just begun, and within the past week. And I think that's, in terms of accountability, that is somewhat lacking. The people who were the Prime Minister, the people who were in office, Matt Hancock, are no longer in post, and there's this sort of limit to how much accountability they can really face. And I think I would just honestly say that Matt Hancock brought this on himself by publishing those diaries first. He has monetised his account of the pandemic. He tried to get his account out first. He shouldn't be surprised that the author he hired to ghostwrite has released more information from that. If he wants full transparency, then he's getting out.
Let's have a very final little thought. This government by WhatsApps and texts and what have you is really, really dangerous, and we all ought to be thinking about how you incorporate public accountability.
Well, let's ask Simon, because you are in government. Lord Bethell says in the interview that he did with Radio 4 today, He utterly rejects it, I think he said, this idea that government is done by WhatsApp, despite all these thousands of WhatsApp messages that have been handed over. Is that what happens in government, or is it about the official meetings and the notes that are taken, and this is an aside?
I think, to be totally candid, it is a bit about both, right? There is a obvious and important structure of proper accountability, and in fairness to the civil service, that is what they make sure does happen for the major decisions. And there is no question that every meeting you're in, as Margaret will know, you've got private secretaries there, you have all the structures of formal minute taking, but equally in an age of instant communication and frankly, the particular circumstances, I suspect, of the spring of 2020, the ability to message quickly and, of course, to speak to your aides, that is bound to be done to a degree on WhatsApp or text messages. And I think it's how as a society we account for that, how as a government, of whatever colour,
yes,
we achieve the right level of records.
All right, well, let's talk about something else. Headline in the Times: harmless vapes are creating teenage addicts. School children hooked on cheap disposable e-cigarettes from China. Now, England's chief medical officer, you heard him in the headlines, Chris Whitty, has attacked the appalling, he calls it, marketing of vapes to children, saying it is clear some products are intended to appeal to underage kids. Let's listen to a little bit more of Sir Chris Whitty.
Marketing vaping, an addictive product with, as you imply, unknown consequences for developing minds to children is utterly unacceptable. Yet it is happening. There's no doubt it's happening because although from a low base, the rates of vaping have doubled in the last couple of years among children. Disposable vapes are clearly, things like Elf Bar, are clearly the kinds of products which look as if they're being marketed in reality at children. And I think we should look very seriously at these products for which the child market appears to be the principal market.
And children, we are talking here about 11 to 15-year-olds, I think, in the main. Let's talk to Simon Morton. He's Deputy Head of Browncoat College in Nottinghamshire. Hello to you. Simon, tell us, how big a problem is this, vaping among children in schools?
That's really hard to sort of gauge in terms of figures and numbers, but what we've seen recently is a county-wide response to this, unfortunately due to some children falling ill from partaking in vaping within some other schools within our county. And I'd like to think, or not like to think rather, that actually as a county we're probably just representing some of the wider concerns that are now making their way into schools.
What do you think about the comments about the marketing? Is that your experience too, the children you talk to, that they are being directly marketed?
That is what is coming, but directly from our students. We like to keep an open dialogue with our students within school to try and understand some of the difficulties they're facing day to day. And the social media platforms, the colouring, the flavouring even is very much levelled at young people at these days.
When you say that some of the children are ill as a result, you think, from smoking these vapes, do you think parents understand the risks to their children?
I don't think it's fully out there, unfortunately. I think if you look at sort of the trend of vapes, they were introduced and sort of marketed as a ploy to sort of detach or give up smoking. And if we look at smoking on a holistic level, of course, the health negatives outweigh vaping from what we currently understand. What that's then caused is sort of a bit of a vacuum in knowledge in terms of parents being able to make a decision as to whether they should be giving their children vapes or not. It seems an acceptable ploy to avoid smoking, unfortunately, and there seems a real detachment from some of the concerns around nicotine alone, because actually that's well documented, the health risks around nicotine, and the intake of nicotine from the vapes is proving to be more significant than potentially 2 packets of cigarettes.
Right, well, I mean, obviously that means they're very strong in that. So what sort of illnesses are you seeing?
From what we understand, it wasn't, well, I think they fell ill because of some of the chemical liquids that were then added to vapes. So from what we understand, this isn't representative of our school, but from what we understand in the county, that children are adding THC as one of the liquids into vapes. And again, that is so accessible to young people these days. What
are you going to do? I mean, what steps can be taken, do you think?
What we're trying to do is get ahead of the curve, but this curve is moving very, very fast. I think from what Chris Whitty just said there about how quickly it's doubled, what we're seeing is that we're having more children, or from what we understand, but the perception is more children are now doing this, then it feels we can actually successfully educate against, but the county are rolling out programs. It's something called the Intent Programme, which is about education and training for staff on how to tackle this within school as well. So, and what we've done as a school, and this is an individual response, is we've not been naive in coming forward to speak to parents about this, that we're trying to raise awareness amongst parents to have those conversations with their children about, are they doing it, do they understand the implications, and hopefully warn them off.
Simon, we're going to bring in the other guests, but stay with us.
Okay.
What action needs to be taken, if any, Simon?
Well, I think on the basis of what we're hearing, schools do need to be empowered to enforce stopping children from...
But what about what the government should do? I mean, should there be regulation?
Well, I mean, it sounds to me, and, you know, I'm not an expert in this field, and I'm always cautious, therefore, about wading in. But, look, it sounds to me as though there is a case for regulation. We wouldn't accept children smoking in school. You know, that is something which... you know, we rightly outlawed an awfully long time ago. I think, you know, look, at a general level, I suspect vaping is better than smoking an actual cigarette because of all the other chemicals involved in that.
Yes, although you just heard there from Simon actually saying it can be the equivalent, depending on what's added to 2 packets of cigarettes.
The addictive qualities as well are really concerning. Look, I mean, I obviously hate smoking in all its guises, and I you know, whilst I do believe in personal freedom, do I think that should extend to children being allowed to get addicted to these products? I'm afraid I don't. I think there probably is a case for regulation.
Alva?
Yeah, well, I mean, apart from at the very, very end, there's maybe a case for regulation. We're not really hearing a strong case for actually regulating these companies. I'm not sure how many Conservative MPs would back that, just given the political instincts of a lot of the Conservative Party. I mean, I think just anecdotally, as a journalist who goes to political party conferences, you can see that this is where tobacco companies are investing their marketing now in vaping, because in a way this is the back door. It's so difficult now as a smoking company to promote cigarettes. That's so limited with the smoking ban and regulation around packaging and so on. So marketing vaping is really the only little area left, and it is mainly being, it's so often sold as the deputy head teacher was mentioning, as this sort of gateway out of smoking. But the kinds of the products, the colours, the flavours, it's all being targeted at children.
It's so cynical, this. I had a conversation with my own 14-year-old daughter about it only the other day. She was saying, it seems to me, Mum, that actually these companies are actively marketing them at children because they know that the smoking rates are going down and they need new customers. I said, yeah, that is spot on. You know, she was saying about somebody's vape was bubblegum flavoured. Well, in what world is that going to be something that appeals to an adult? So I think this is really pernicious. I think they are, it's a bit like the Alco Pops of yesteryear, you know, dressing up alcohol in lemonade-shaped bottles and making out that there's nothing in it. Actively marketing children is just morally corrupt.
Right, well, when it comes to regulation, headline here in Politico, UK mulls new tax on vaping. Just to tell our viewers, Scotland is banning disposable vapes completely. Should they do that here, Margaret? And should they introduce a tax?
Well, I wouldn't go for, interesting enough, I don't think that's the best way of tackling the issue in this. I think what we didn't talk about, I'm not even sure making it illegal is the best way, but we should tackle the advertising. We should tackle the advertising. Now, Simon, as a sort of free marketeer, might sort of be against state interference on that, but I think that is really where I'd go. And I'm of the generation... the oldest one here, I'm of the generation that remembers smoking. I smoked when I was really young.
Dr. Smoke Camels, right?
Yeah,
you know,
Dr. Smoke Camels, and it was a good thing. It was good for your health.
Yeah.
And if you don't tackle that early on, and actually, and I think I would do it. The state intervention should be through advertising. The school intervention should be through education.
But what about price? I mean, they're cheaper than cigarettes. I mean, that's also a problem. I mean, I've got some quotes from the mother of a teenage girl in Gloucester who's addicted to vaping. She's 15. She's been smoking for vaping, I should say, for 2 years. She says it's constant. She can't live without it. She takes her vape to school. Most of her friends do. She doesn't just puff on it. It's all the time. She gets through one a day. I have tried to tell her it's bad for her, and she doesn't care. And she goes on to say, I hate that shop owners sell them to her. If she can't buy one, she pulls up walkers by to go in and get a vape for her, which it really underlines the addictive quality. But they're cheaper.
Well, I mean, look, as I say, I think this is something where there does need to be a more sophisticated debate than there has been to date about what we can most proportionately do. I do agree with Margaret. I think the advertising point, and to your point, Camilla, that, you know, we can't allow this to be marketed to kids as easily as it is at the moment. But there may be a case for going further than that. And, ultimately, I do think it would be pretty perverse if we ended up with a new epidemic of addiction. Yeah. And we don't know the effects, but I suspect they can't be good.
Right.
Put it like that.
I mean, there is a target, as you all know, to make England, it might be, rather than the UK, but smoke-free by 2030. But this could be the unforeseen consequence that in order to reach that target, laudable as it may be, that, as you say, you have a new generation of people addicted to vape.
These are young children who are going to vaping without touching cigarettes. The whole point of it, the introduction of vaping, was that it was to take people off cigarettes.
Quite.
So, we've got marketing directly to young people through the flavours and the colours and whatever is just wrong. I really think that's the best way of tackling it, together with education and work through schools and in the family.
Well, Simon, you've been listening to the discussion. What do you think, if anything, the government should do?
I think the marketing around the packaging would be something that would be very easy to. However, from what we understand, it's also infiltrating the algorithms on social media platforms. So they're getting it from all avenues at the moment, which I think is going to make it even harder to sort of detach from what is expected of, I suppose, within normal teenage culture at the moment. I think the worry is, and the point that was made is, the concerns about the rising habits that seem to be forming. I'm concerned that we've already got a generation here that are potentially addicted to this. And the question for me is, how do we pull back so many teenagers from an addiction?
Simon Mawson, thank you very much. Let's talk about another important issue, which is housing. This headline in The Guardian: England's new housing supply likely to fall to lowest level in decades, says a study. Simon, was it wrong for the government to scrap compulsory housing targets?
Yes.
And why? Why did they do it?
Because, well, look, in the end, there is a debate which goes across our politics, because there is an issue with the way in which all politicians, I suspect, respond to new housing. And I think Margaret and I will both experience it. Every time a new development is proposed anywhere, I will get lobbied fiercely by any community to say no, flat no, not can we make this project better, can we make sure that the infrastructure is in place? It's just, there is a lot of pressure, and it's very easy to give way to that pressure. But what we're seeing here is the consequence of the politics of following that logically through, which is that we are short, not by tens of thousands, not by hundreds of thousands, but by millions of homes that we need in this country. And then we wonder why housing and rents are so unaffordable.
How do you change attitudes, though? Your colleague Theresa Villiers was sitting here, Conservative colleague. She was one of those that blocked the move to housing targets. What do you say to people like her?
I'm afraid, and I like Theresa a lot, and we agree on an awful lot, but she is wrong on this. And, there is a debate which I am determined to lead and to win, to make sure that my party, which is ultimately the party of opportunity, of building capital in your life, honours that pledge. And actually there is a whole generation of people, not in their 20s, but in their 30s and 40s, who can't afford to live a decent life because their homes are not fit for purpose, and their rents and their mortgages are totally out of whack with what the type of home that they're getting.
I mean, I can't disagree with Simon. I think we've actually switched in thinking from being NIMBY to far more YIMBY, and I would include our readership in that. You might associate a Telegraph readership with the kind of people that might write to Simon and say, not in my backyard. And at the same time, these are people who have got children and grandchildren, and they're worried that they can't live nearby them in the home counties or wherever, because it's completely unaffordable. I live in a small rural village in Hertfordshire. There have been new homes built. They've been built in appropriate places. No one's talking about concreting over the countryside. Exactly. That's the fear, and there's a political fear from the Tories because they think that the Lib Dems campaigned on this in Chesham and Amersham near me, and of course were quite successful on it. If the development is appropriate and in the right place and doesn't look out of kilter, and I think there's an emphasis on brownfield rather than green, which is hugely popular with all rotors of all different hues.
But it still doesn't happen. But it still doesn't happen because of the political objections. You are somebody in the category that we are talking about. What is your personal experience?
I mean, I pay £950 a month to rent in London. I'm on a decent enough salary at Politico, but buying a house is completely out of reach for me, and that's not a sort of, tiny violin for me, but really just I'm totally representative of my generation. I think, and I actually just think because of the kinds of people who make up the intake in Parliament, the kind of people who tend to be commentators, we just don't hear that enough. When we saw mortgage rates spiral under Liz Truss,
it got a lot of...
It did get a lot of traction. People understood rightly how serious that was, how that was affecting people. But I just think for younger people, like the stark reality really is that unless you have parents to help you with a really generous mortgage, or you can live at home and save for a substantial amount of time, or you're on, a really generous six-figure salary in London, basically.
That is the reality, isn't it? It
It's
would be a
basically out of
six-figure
reach.
salary in London.
And we know that not everyone can earn that kind of money. We can't have a whole generation of corporate bankers. So it's just completely out of reach. And this really is just symptomatic of the chaos in the Tory party right now. That Rishi Sunak
I have to pull you up on that.
Well, except the Tory party did in the end.
There is a particular problem. I would agree with this.
Right.
With a certain amount of pressure, because of the constituencies that we represent, which in many cases are those which fear planning the most. But look,
I will come back to you, Simon, but I just want to bring Margaret in on that issue. Is it planning? Is planning the problem in the way Simon has outlined, Margaret?
I don't think it is. I think it's a tiny thing on the side.
Do you?
Yes, because there are plenty of planning permissions around, and there are plenty.
There aren't enough.
There are plenty of planning permissions around, and there are plenty of brownfield sites. Because I think Simon wants to build more on greenfield.
No, I don't.
And there's stuff that you could do, like build homes on top of tube stations and railway stations. There are 800,000 fewer homeowners today than there were in 2010. So it is about building more. But what I would add to it is it's not just about building more for owner occupation. The problem now is that the privately rented market is absolutely saturated with people who in the past would have been in a social housing, in a council house or in a housing association house. So it's not just releasing planning permissions. We've actually got to put public money, capital, not revenue, capital money, into building more affordable homes for social rent, so that people have a decent home at a price they can afford. That would release the pressure in the privately rented sector. And it isn't just about building for owner occupation, it's building for those who are homeless, those who are in bed and breakfast, and those who are at the bottom end of the...
I'm just going to pause just for a moment, just before I come to you, Simon, while we're talking about this. Let's welcome viewers from BBC News Channel. We're talking about housing and whether planning should be liberalised and the problem of home ownership as the panel sees it just at the moment. Simon.
Well, I mean, to correct Margaret, I definitely believe in brownfield first, but we shouldn't also kid ourselves that brownfield alone is enough. We are going to have a more grown-up debate than that, and there have been some recent studies showing that, brownfield can only meet a proportion of the housing shortfall that we have. I completely believe that we need investment in all kinds of tenure. The government does spend billions through Homes England on delivering projects, including critically affordable projects, which we all want to see. But I just don't think we can shy away from the fact the fundamental issue is around planning. We need to staff up and invest the planning departments of councils more so that they can be more effective. But we also need to win the political argument. What the Lib Dems did, and Camilla referred to it in Chesham and Amersham, was lethal to home building because it sent a message to lots of MPs. The only way to try and escape this is to feed the monster. We've got to be better and braver than that and make the argument that if we want a society where people can afford a home of their own and have affordable rent, then we need to face the trade-offs involved in that, and that means building homes.
Right, let me just show you this headline. It's related, but a different story. Homelessness, rough sleeping, up more than a quarter in a year. The government promised to end the blight of rough sleeping by 2024. What's gone wrong?
Well, the reality is that this is part of the pandemic fallout, that the exceptional amounts of funding that were invested during the pandemic are now easing back because, I mean, that was the amount we were spending during the pandemic was totally unsustainable. But look, this is a moral mission. We need to keep building the homes that we need.
Honestly, I agree with a lot of what you said, Simon, but on the social housing, on those, the homeless, the rough sleepers and that, the investment in whether it's housing association housing or council housing has fallen abysmally over the last 20 years, so I wouldn't even just even stop it under you. And unless you actually tackle that at that bottom end, there's an owner-occupation problem, which you're confronting, but there is a real homelessness, rough-sleeving problem, and you can only do that but actually having public investment in housing, public subsidies
I don't
through
disagree
housing
with that.
associations and council, and that's what's creating that problem.
We've only got about 5 or 6 minutes until we get to Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. You will have noticed this week we've talked an awful lot about what is now being called the Windsor Framework, the new Brexit deal or arrangements for Northern Ireland. Rishi Sunak has been selling it all week. What's your verdict?
I think we have to be gracious and say it is a very significant advance on where we have found ourselves hitherto under the protocol, which was the best that could be secured in the chaos of the autumn of 2019. I think there are important questions, and that's why I, along with a number of my colleagues, dozens and dozens of my colleagues, are going to wait for the expert analysis to come through from the legal experts convened by the ERG to actually understand the full ramifications of what is being proposed here, because there are important issues we need to bottom out, including, for example, around the emergency brake. Does it apply to the updating of EU law? What are the retaliatory measures?
So you could vote against it?
I think at this point, look, I recognise this is a very significant improvement, and I suspect that the absolute logic of this is it will go through. But I think there are important things we need to flesh out.
But you're reserving judgment still?
I'm reserving judgment because, as I say, on the emergency brake, does it apply to the updating of EU law? What are the retaliatory measures that we can face if we exercise it? How do we account for the differences between how the EU and the UK seem to be interpreting different parts of this agreement? What does it mean for our ability to diverge critically from EU law? These are all questions we just need to understand before we make a final decision.
Margaret?
Well, I don't feel very gracious about where Rishi Sunak has got. I mean, I'm shocked by what Simon is saying, but I don't feel gracious about it because this is a crisis of the Conservative Party making. We were having had an oven-ready deal. You were part of the government, Simon, that signed this deal and that created the 7 problems.
Yeah, and Margaret, you were part of
I didn't interrupt.
No, okay. Well, I'll make my point in a moment, though, because it is important.
That you were part of the government that created this deal and had these 7 demands now of the DUP are ones that come out of the very, very flawed deal that you did. In my view, Simon, I would just say to you, for goodness sake, put the interests of the people of Northern Ireland at the top of your agenda. In goodness sake, we need something which brings back government to Northern Ireland and not to vote this deal through. I mean, there'll only be 30 or so of the Conservatives in that vote. We will all vote in the national interest, in Northern Irish people's interest on that. And you should not be creating these new problems and questions.
These are questions which we need to understand because they do have profound ramifications, both for Northern Ireland and for the rest of the UK.
You wanted Brexit, and Brexit means that there is a new relationship between those parts of Britain and Ireland. And for actually, Rishi Sunak just said, tell the Northern Irish people that they are in this fantastic, brilliant
we'll come on to that in just a second.
Where they can have both the single market and the British market.
And also control of our laws.
I couldn't believe that.
But there will be some incredulity. You yourself have just said that it is better than what you signed up to before. I'm just going to literally show viewers the inside of the chamber. House of Commons chamber will be going there into just a few minutes' time for Prime Minister's questions. Alva, you wanted to...
I would just ask, Simon, you said that this is unquestionably an improvement on the original deal which you voted for. So by what possible logic would you not vote for this improvement?
And look, Alva, to that point, it is an improvement, and very likely, as I say, this will go through the House of Commons. But it is also important that
very likely it will go through the House of Commons. Because the whole of the Labour Party will vote for it.
And look, it is just important that we understand what the ramifications of this are. And, there are genuine questions about this emergency brake. There are genuine questions about the implications for our ability to diverge. There are genuine questions about the EU law that will continue to apply in Northern Ireland.
You raised those issues last time. You voted for it anyway.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important that when we try... Basically, what happened was, in 2019, we had to find a way of honouring Brexit and getting out because the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, together with a tiny minority of Conservative MPs, had stopped us leaving.
Right. I mean, short of saying there might have been a bit of rewriting of history on both sides, just to say that Peter Barnes, my colleague from the Political Research Unit, will be on hand and on standby to bring up and verify any dubious facts and claims made by the politicians during Prime Minister's questions. On the issue that Margaret raised about the unique position that Northern Ireland finds itself in, having a boost from not only having access to the EU single market as well as GB internal market. If it's good enough for Northern Ireland, why not advocate the rest of the UK having that marvellous position?
It did seem to be slightly contradictory there. I think that was Mr Sunak kind of trying to gee up morale over this new deal, and he seemed cock-a-hoop about it when he presented it with the European Commission President. Look, I actually think that quite a lot of concessions have been made on both sides on this, and it's quite refreshing to see that degree of kind of seemingly meaningful negotiation as opposed to some of the political posturing that we had back in 2019, I think. It is interesting that the Brexiteers are holding their counsel. Some have gone forward in support of the deal. David Davis. There may be political reasons for that because, of course, David Davis wants a deal to succeed that might cost Boris Johnson not to, let's put it that way. The Star Chamber are looking at it. We've also heard from Sunak today that, he doesn't seem to think that the DUP support is contingent on the deal, even though when it comes to power sharing in Northern Ireland, I would suggest it can only be a success if the Stormont Assembly meets and the unionist parties are represented at the table.
Right, just to pause for a moment, because I think Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons, is probably preparing to introduce Prime Minister's question, so forgive me if I interrupt. But Margaret, do you think Labour should commit to single market for the whole of the UK? Now, Rishi Sunak seems to think it's such a good idea for Northern Ireland.
I'll come to... the only thing I wanted to say to Camilla, it is awful.
I'm afraid.
This is all being discussed as within the Conservative Party.
I'm going to have to pause.
Speaker,
in we go.
I wish everyone, but in particular my honourable friend from Montgomeryshire, a very happy St David's Day. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister understands the importance of NHS staff because he was out there every Thursday night clapping for them during the pandemic. He must therefore also surely know that he hasn't got a hope of dealing with the NHS crisis if he doesn't invest in its workforce. We have a plan to double medical places and end the scandal of straight A students being denied the chance to become a doctor. Patients support our plan. The NHS supports our plan. Even his Chancellor supports our plan. Why doesn't he?
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman needs to keep up. We are doing a workforce plan for the NHS. There are tens of thousands more doctors, more nurses in the NHS, record number of GPs, record investment in the NHS. That's what you get with a Conservative government delivering.
Mr Speaker, will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the staff of Nottingham University Hospitals Trust who, faced with a challenging winter with 300 COVID and flu patients, as well as thousands of appointments affected by industrial action, who have succeeded in reducing the backlog of those waiting more than 18 months for surgery by a quarter in just a month? And will he further reaffirm the Government's commitment to the redevelopment of the Queen's Medical Centre and City Hospitals, the second biggest hospital investment programme in the country?
Prime Minister. Well, I join my honourable friend in thanking everyone at Nottingham University Hospitals Trust for their fantastic work, and I can confirm that we are committed to a new hospital scheme at Queen's Medical Centre and City Hospital as part of our new hospital programme. I know that progress is being made, and I look forward to seeing the project come to completion.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I join the Prime Minister in wishing everybody a happy St David's Day. Mr Speaker, after 13 years of Tory failure, the average family in Britain will be poorer than the average family in Poland by 2030. Exactly. That's a shocking state of affairs. If the Tories limp on in government, we're going to see a generation of young people learning to say Auf Wiedersehen, pet in Polish, aren't we?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's clear to everyone that the biggest impact on households' living standards is the energy prices that we're suffering at the moment as a result of an illegal war in Ukraine. And I'll just remind the honourable gentleman what we are doing to ease people through that. Because of our energy price guarantee, right now, the government is paying over half of a typical household energy bill, saving households right now £1,000. It is one of the most generous support schemes globally. Now, he knows future decisions to support cost of living are for the budget, but if he's concerned about the cost of living, what he should do is stop making inflationary, unfunded spending commitments and back our plan to halve inflation.
The dictionary definition for unfunded commitments is last year's kamikaze budget. Mr. Speaker, the only country in the G7 still poorer than it was before the pandemic, and he stands there pretending it's all fine. Total denial about the damage and decline that he is presiding over. Delivering growth and tackling the cost of living crisis will mean standing up to vested interests. Energy bills are going to go up by £900 in April. He knows he's going to have to act, but who's going to pay? Hard-working families through higher taxes and more borrowing, or the oil and gas giants celebrating record profits?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable gentleman. He made a rare trip out of North London to visit Davos. Recently. Perhaps while he was there, he missed the survey of 4,000 global CEOs from 100 different countries that ranked the United Kingdom as their #1 European investment destination. Now, if he's serious about getting the economy growing, then he should stand up to the vested interests in the unions and back our minimum service levels.
Mr. Speaker, here's the thing. All the CEOs of business saying there's only one party with a plan for growth, and it's this party here. And there's only one party that broke the economy, and they're sitting there. Now, on energy bills, it's not as complicated as he pretends. Oil and gas companies are making vast, unexpected profits, whilst working people face misery of higher bills. He can boast all he likes, but companies like Shell didn't pay a penny in windfall tax last year, and they're still not paying their fair share now. Why doesn't he admit his mistake, get rid of the loopholes in his botched windfall tax, and finally choose family finances over oil profits?
Mr. Speaker, there's a theme here. He seems to forget, as Chancellor, I introduced a new tax on energy companies. Energy companies will pay a 75% tax rate on extraordinary profits, comparable, indeed higher than other North Sea nations. Now, that's what his shadow levelling up secretary called for recently. But I've got good news for them. We did it a year ago. They've got to keep up. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, they claim to support levelling up, but they really do need to keep up.
Keir Starmer, he introduced a tax on Shell and they haven't paid a penny. Fantastic work. If he was serious about investing in the future of the country, he'd start with housing. A few months ago, his backbenchers forced him to scrap house-building targets. At the time, he stood there and said it would mean they would build more homes. Well, would you believe it? A few months later, the Home Builders Federation say house building is going to fall to its lowest level in 75 years. Now, he can change course on this. He can bring back targets and planning reforms, or he can duck that fight and let a generation down. Which is it?
Prime Minister. Actually, Mr. Speaker, we've had recordly high numbers of house building and indeed the highest number of first-time buyers in around 20 years under this government. But he talks about investing for the long term of our country, and that's important when it comes to energy security, Mr. Speaker. But Labour's policy is to oppose any new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. It is an absurd policy that would see us paying billions to countries abroad for our energy while shipping it here with twice the carbon emissions. It's typical political posturing. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for our security, just like the Labour Party.
Because of the noise, I don't think the Prime Minister is hearing the questions, because I do think it was on house building. Keir Starmer.
On house building, Mr. Speaker, that's the lowest level for 75 years. A whole generation of people desperate to get on the housing ladder, 13 years in power, and all he's got to say to them is, it's somebody else's fault, let me deflect. No wonder they're furious with his government. And it's not just bills or housing. Families are paying over £1,000 a month just to send their child to nursery. If he scrapped his non-dom status, he could start to fund better childcare, put money back in people's pockets and get parents back to work. Seems a pretty simple choice to me. So what's he going to choose? Wealthy tax avoiders or hard-working parents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we want to see what happens with house building under a Labour government, just look what's going on in London, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to tax, the facts don't suit his argument. Let's just go over them. The wealthiest pay more tax, the poorest pay less tax than under any year of the last Labour government, Mr. Speaker. Now, about his plans, he's already spent the money he claims he'd raised from that policy on 5 different things, Mr. Speaker. It's the same old Labour Party, always running out of other people's money.
Mr. Speaker, he's never happier than he's pretending everything's fine or blaming someone else. And didn't we just see it there? He is choosing tax avoiders over hard-working parents. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to finish this session without asking about the COVID disclosures in today's Daily Telegraph. Now, we don't know the truth of what happened yet. There are too many messages and too many unknowns. Oh, but families across the country will look at this, and the sight of politicians writing books, portraying themselves as heroes, or selectively leaking messages will be insulting and ghoulish spectacle for them. At the heart of this is every family who made enormous sacrifices for the good of the country, or who tragically lost loved ones. The country deserves better. The COVID inquiry has already cost the taxpayer £85 million and hasn't heard from a single government minister yet. So can the Prime Minister assure the House no more delays, that the inquiry will have whatever support it needs to report by the end of this year?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the last couple of years were an incredibly difficult time for everyone involved in the health service, and I pay tribute to all their hard work, and I know the House will join me in that regard. And now, rather than comment on piecemeal bits of information, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will agree with me the right way for these things to be looked at is the COVID inquiry. That's why we've established the COVID inquiry, and he will know, as he has mentioned it 1 or 2 times before, that he was a lawyer in a previous life, that there is a proper process to these things. It is an independent inquiry. It has the resources it needs. It has the powers it needs. And what we should all do in this House is let them get on and do their job.
I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's work to resolve the Rubik's Cube of the Northern Ireland Protocol. This opens the prospect for resuming more positive relations with our nearest neighbours. Last week, Imperial College generously hosted an event to celebrate 25 years of the Environmental Audit Committee's scrutiny work. Academics from Imperial and the other world-class universities that support our work have been clamouring to re-engage with their research partners through Horizon and other programmes. Can my right honourable friend assure the House that he has commenced negotiations to resume an association for the UK with Horizon Europe?
Minister. Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his support for the Windsor framework. He's right about the benefits that it can bring, and also join him in paying tribute to our incredible research community who do a fantastic job. I can assure my right honourable friend that we will continue to work with the EU in a range of areas, not just research collaboration, but also strengthening our sanctions against Russia, energy security, and crucially, illegal migration. I look forward to those discussions and hope we can conclude them productively on a range of different areas.
We now come to SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Yesterday, the Prime Minister said that EU single market access was special, exciting and attractive. If that's the case, why is he denying it to the rest of us?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that the honourable gentleman is seeking to play politics with the situation in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, as he well knows, has a unique place in the United Kingdom, and what we are trying to do is restore the balance inherent in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and he would do well to acknowledge that.
Stephen Flynn! Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. What the Prime Minister said yesterday was that EU single market access will be a good thing for business. Now, of course, that's in contrast to the leader of the Labour Party, who said in December that EU single market access would not boost economic growth. Does it hurt the Prime Minister to know that the Labour Party believe in Brexit more than he does?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to Northern Ireland, the important thing to note is to avoid a land border on the island of Ireland between North and South. That is what is crucial to achieve in getting the right framework for the arrangements in Northern Ireland, and the businesses there that trade across that border on a daily basis with complex supply chains need and value that access. That is something that the Windsor Framework has sought to achieve, and I believe delivers it. It's not about the macro issue of membership of the European Union. It's about getting the right mechanisms in place to support businesses and communities in Northern Ireland. And I would say to the honourable gentleman, he knows better than that. He knows that this is about Northern Ireland, and I hope that he can support what we've agreed.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister, like me, was excited to see the first new nuclear reactor for a UK power station in more than 3 decades arrive at Hinkley-C this week. Will the Prime Minister make it his personal mission to deliver vital new nuclear power at Wilver in my constituency of Unismorn, one of the best nuclear sites in the UK?
Prime Minister. Well, when it comes to our energy policy, the important thing is to focus on our long-term energy security. That means more renewables, more offshore wind, hydrogen, CCS, and indeed more nuclear. Wilfer remains one of the best nuclear sites in the UK, and the strong support from the local community and indeed my honourable friend makes an attractive site for the UK's nuclear revival, and I know great nuclear, British nuclear, when that body is up and running, will be taking a very close look at it.
Colin Beachwood.
Well, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it's great to hear the conversion that the Prime Minister has had on the benefits of the single market. Given Northern Ireland's access to the dual market, both markets, and the benefits that brings, will his government commit to investing in infrastructure and higher education provision to maximise that benefit?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his engagement and support in developing the Windsor Framework. I think it delivers on what he wanted, which is to ensure that we do protect Northern Ireland's businesses and the supply chains that they have, and I can give him that commitment. He and I both want to see more investment in Northern Ireland, not just from the government, but also from the private sector. This agreement will unlock that investment. But critically, a step on that journey is to have a reformed executive, something that I know everyone in this House would like to see.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Does my right honourable friend agree that in these difficult times the free world must stand together? And with that in mind, would he also agree that strengthening our friendships and support with other countries in Europe is important? Will he welcome the delegation here today from Lithuania? And does he agree with me that the decision to hold the head of states of NATO meeting in Lithuania, in Vilnius in July, shows what a strong ally they are, and also how important we think it is to strengthen the eastern flank?
Prime Minister.
No, I agree with my right honourable friend. I'm delighted that Lithuania and the city of Vilnius will host the NATO Leaders Summit in July, and the UK does have a strong and growing relationship with Lithuania. It was just yesterday that their defence minister was here supporting our efforts together with them to train Ukrainian soldiers, and at the summit we will work together to ensure we can deter and defend against Russian aggression by making sure that we implement the next phase of the most radical military transformation since the 1960s.
Sarah Chuck.
To date, 79 people have been killed on smart motorways. Last January, the government said it would pause their rollout. The Prime Minister said smart motorways are unpopular because they are unsafe. We need to listen to drivers and stop with the pursuit of policies that go against common sense. Since then, 3 new schemes have gone live, with 3 more expected shortly. Prime Minister, especially during a cost of living crisis, how do you justify pushing ahead with these death trap roads?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, safety on our roads is our absolute priority, and we will do everything we can to make sure drivers do feel safe. Last year, we in fact paused the rollout of smart motorways not already in construction while we consider the data and next steps. And in the meantime, we've committed almost £900 million for safety improvements across the entire network.
Angela Richardson.
Zero Carbon Guildford won national recognition here in Parliament, receiving the Climate Coalition's Innovative UK Community Project Award. They've taken what is often an overwhelming subject and turned it into local issues with tangible solutions to give people agency. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating all the volunteers, including Ben, Izzy and Mark, on their award? And does he agree that grassroots organisations like Zero Carbon Guildford are key stakeholders in our national journey to achieve net zero?
Prime Minister. I join my honourable friend in congratulating Zero Carbon Guildford for receiving the Climate Coalition's Innovative UK Community Project Award. She's absolutely right that community empowerment, engagement and action can play a role in supporting the UK's transition to net zero, enabling communities to access the benefits that it brings, from greener jobs to improved health.
Cal Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with RCN nurses, and one of the biggest challenges that they face is the crumbling buildings of the Royal Lancaster Infirmary. Hospital bosses were promised capital funding as part of one of these so-called 40 new hospitals back in January, but it's March and they haven't seen a penny. So how many broken hospitals and broken promises will it take for the Prime Minister to finally fix something?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're investing record sums in the hospital capital upgrade programme across the country. I'm very happy to make sure that we're making progress on the scheme that she mentioned and ensure that gets the detail of that. But not just the 40 hospitals, but 90 upgrades around the country and up to 300 community diagnostic centres and electrical surgical hubs. This is a government that is backing the NHS with the resources it needs.
Craig Tracy.
Mr. Speaker, the tragic death of more than 50 people over the weekend when their small boat broke up off the coast of Italy is a sad reminder of the total disregard for life that the illegal traffickers who facilitate these crossings have in order to make their money. So can the Prime Minister set out what steps he's taken to bring an end to this barbaric trade, and also to reassure my constituents that stopping illegal immigration remains a key priority for this government?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is right that the tragic incident near Italy at the weekend demonstrates how too well illegal crossings put lives at risk. That's why last year the Home Secretary and I announced 5 new measures to tackle the problem of small boats crossings, including the largest ever boats deal with France and a landmark deal with Albania. But we must do more. And as soon as the legislation is ready, it will be brought to this House to ensure that if you arrive in this country illegally, you will not be able to stay. You will be swiftly detained and removed to your own country or a safe third country alternative. That is the right and responsible way to tackle this problem.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and I have one thing in common. We've both had to step in and sort out legal and constitutional messes created by his predecessor but one, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge. Now, the Prime Minister has boasted that his new Brexit deal puts Northern Ireland in an unbelievably special position because it will have access to both the UK and the EU markets. And he said that this makes it the world's most exciting economic zone. So my question for the Prime Minister is this. If there can be a very, very special status for the province of Northern Ireland, why can't there be a very, very special status for the nation of Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a very special status for the nation of Scotland, and that's inside our United Kingdom.
Inequality University Health Board was yet again put in special measures. The chairman and the whole board resigned en masse as they no longer have faith in the Welsh Labour government. Yet on a call earlier this week, the Welsh Health Minister told me that it wasn't Welsh Labour government's fault that healthcare has collapsed in North Wales. Now, given that Labour run the NHS in North Wales, can you suggest to the people of North Wales whose fault it is and who should put it right?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's concern, and the House will know that health is a devolved matter for the Labour-run government in Wales, where 1 in 5 people, Mr. Speaker, in the entire country of Wales are now on a waiting list. So the government there should focus on the people's priorities and start cutting waiting lists, as we are doing here in England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent survey I did in Edinburgh West showed that a heartbreaking 80% of those who responded said the high cost of energy meant they would have to ration it. Now, I do not represent a deprived area of the country. And almost a quarter of Scottish homes now live in fuel poverty, not helped, of course, by the total absence of an insulation programme by the Scottish Government. So will the Prime Minister now accept that to allow the price cap to rise will only make things worse for millions of families? And given the significant reduction in the costs of wholesale energy, will he accept that it's now time to listen to the Liberal Democrats and cut bills to April last year's levels?
Mr. Speaker, it's the Liberal Democrat shadow energy secretary who said that there was no role for nuclear power in our future energy industry is not something that we need to listen to. But with regard to supporting people with energy bills, as I said earlier, because of the energy price guarantee, we're paying typically around half of a family's energy bill at the moment. That's worth £1,000 at the moment. But the support doesn't end there, Mr. Speaker. Over this next year, there will be around £1,000 of direct support to the most vulnerable families across the nation with their energy bills. And with regard to energy efficiency, I agree with her, it is important, which is why this government has allocated over £6 billion over this Parliament. And the new schemes that we've just put in place will help hundreds of thousands of households across the country, saving them around £300 on their bills through improvements to their energy efficiency. And you're right, it should be available everywhere, including in Scotland.
Alberta Costa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chairman of the All-Party Group for Greece, can I put on record how sad we all are for the tragic train accident that's happened in Greece and for the tragic loss of life? Mr. Speaker, double child rapist and killer Colin Pitchfork is once again up for parole next month. Now, I know the Prime Minister doesn't have any decision-making process in terms of the Independent Parole Board, but can he organise an urgent meeting with the Secretary of State for Justice so I can refer my constituents' views about this dangerous man and he can take that into account in his submissions to the Independent Parole Board?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Pitchfork's crimes were heinous, and our thoughts remain with Linda and Dawn's friends and family. My honourable friend knows that it is for the Parole Board to determine these decisions, but my honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, will be submitting his views on the Pitchfork case to the Parole Board before the oral hearing, is happy to meet with the honourable gentleman again, and we have also recently published a root and branch review of the Parole Board system, which outlined our plans to introduce greater ministerial oversight, and I look forward to having the contributions and thoughts on that from my honourable friend.
Ruth Cabret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, new figures showed that there's been a 26% increase in people sleeping rough. Meanwhile, a Conservative Party donor spent £25,000 on a crystal-encrusted portrait of the Prime Minister, and another paid £40,000 for a shooting trip. Wow. Doesn't this show just how out of touch the Conservative Party is on the cost of living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, rough sleeping levels are actually 35% lower in this past year compared to the peak That's partly as a result of the £2 billion of extra investment that we've made over these 3 years to tackle rough sleeping, and we continue to have one of the lowest rates of rough sleeping in the world globally when last measured. But we'll continue to do more, Mr. Sleeper. We don't want anyone to have to sleep rough, and because of the innovations that we have made, we're taking more and more people off the streets, and the government will keep delivering more.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, last month the Pines Primary School in Bracknell achieved a good rating in its Ofsted inspection. That in itself is laudable. What's significant is that the Pines is now the 40th of 40 eligible schools in Bracknell to be graded good or outstanding. Mr. Speaker, this clean sweep is an outstanding achievement, and I'm very proud of everyone locally. So would the Prime Minister please join with me in congratulating our fantastic teachers, staff, governors and pupils, and also Councillor Gareth Barnard and the entire education team at Conservative-run Bracknell Forest Council.
Well, Mr. Speaker, education is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet for transforming people's lives, so I'm delighted to join with my honourable friend in praising everyone involved, from the councillor to the teachers to the staff to the governors, for delivering such fantastic results. They are in the business of providing tremendous opportunity for the children under their care, and we all owe them an enormous debt of gratitude.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Citizens Advice estimate that the number of households unable to afford their energy bills will double from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 from April. Labour, Mr. Speaker, has a plan to help struggling families right across the country now. Why can't the Prime Minister see the need to take action on energy bills now, avoid the cliff edge, and they can shout all they like, Mr. Speaker, and stop plunging more people into poverty from April?
Mr. Speaker, we are helping people now. We are helping people with the energy price guarantee that is ensuring that there is a £1,000 saving on their energy bills right now. And, Mr. Speaker, we're providing further support over the coming year for the most vulnerable, with direct cost of living support worth up to £1,000, but also a record increase in pensions, record increase in benefits, and a record increase in the national living wage, because that's what a Conservative government does.
Of ceramics businesses are SMEs, which has meant they've not received the level of support that many other energy-intensive sectors have. So will my right honourable friend look at what more support, particularly financial support, can be offered to help this sector to decarbonise and invest in energy efficiency measures?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know my honourable friend is a powerful advocate for his ceramics industry, and rightly so. It's been a pleasure to meet with him and his businesses in the past. He'll know that our energy bill discount scheme does support businesses with their energy bills through to March of next year, and there are a range of other funds we have to support energy-intensive industries, the scheme that he mentioned, but also the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which provides capital grants to businesses like his to help them decarbonise, and I look forward to discussing this with him and his businesses in the near future.
Patrick Ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been announced that on the 7th of May, a coronation choir will perform at Windsor Castle, comprised of some of the UK's keenest community choirs and amateur singers, such as refugee choirs, NHS choirs, LGBTQ+ singing groups, and deaf signing choirs. If it turns out that any of the refugees taking part in that choir have arrived here on small boats or from a safe third country, should they be deported to Rwanda before or after they sing for the King?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it's amazing. It is amazing when previously we have had a question about the awful tragedy of illegal migration that happened just recently, that the honourable gentleman can't accept that it is, in fact, there is absolutely nothing compassionate about tolerating illegal migration when people are dying. That's why this government will bring forward legislation to improve the system here, and is absolutely right that if people come here illegally, they should be sent to a safe alternative, because that is the only way we will break the cycle of these criminal gangs and stop people dying needlessly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A school in my constituency was complaining that they cannot afford to turn the heating on. Yet this school and others are spending money on PSHE materials by organisations such as Stonewall and Jigsaw that are educating our boys and girls that they may not have been born in the right body or have an intergender identity. Would the PM meet with me to see how we can stop this unscientific, ideological education being taught in our schools and get our children learning what they should be learning in a warm, safe place?
Mr. Speaker, we have boosted school funding by around £2 billion in each of the next 2 years, which will help schools manage their energy costs. But we do expect schools to take responsible and sensible decisions on their RHSE materials and making sure that those materials are age appropriate, suitable, politically impartial and value for money. I look forward to discussing this with him in the future, and I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Final question, Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may be aware of Sky News' investigation and report today on the over-the-counter sales of nitrous oxide or laughing gas to children and young teenagers. One alarming aspect is the change in the size of canisters from 8 grams to 620 grams. Wow. And ambulance call-outs related to overuse have tripled. Instead of criminalising the young people who buy nitrous oxide, isn't it time to take urgent action against those knowingly selling this harmful and potentially life-changing substance to children underage?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. I share her concern and the concern of members across the House about nitrous oxide's detrimental impact on communities, its contribution to antisocial behaviour, and indeed I mentioned it in the speech I made at the beginning of this year specifically. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs is conducting a review of nitrous oxide and is looking particularly at this question. The Home Secretary has asked them to expedite their review, and we will consider their advice carefully when it is received.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
As you heard Sir Lindsay Hoyle saying, that's the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions. It's time to introduce our guests for this part of the programme, Politics Live. For the Government, the Conservative Party Chairman Greg Hands, and for Labour, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury Pat McFadden, and the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent Nick Eardley. Welcome to all of you. Before we get into the main substance of Keir Starmer, the Labour leader's questions to Rishi Sunak, he raised and reflected on the story we were discussing earlier in the programme about a tranche of WhatsApp messages that have been released to the Daily Telegraph that seem to undermine the claim by the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, that there was a protective ring put around care homes. Keir Starmer said it was a ghoulish spectacle, seeing books, WhatsApp messages before the public COVID inquiry actually takes place, and he called on Rishi Sunak to say and commit that it would happen by the end of this year. In fact, it would wrap up. There'd be a report by the end of this year. What's happened exactly to the public inquiry, Nick?
Well, I mean, it's going on, but we've got no idea how long it's going to take. The first section of it's due to take about 4 months, but there's no sense of when we might get some results from it. Some people close to the process suggesting it may be kept until after a general election that we actually get anything tangible in terms of conclusions.
Is that really acceptable, Greg Hands? I mean, we are now seeing various people give their version of events, key players, and yet families who lost relatives and loved ones during the pandemic still haven't heard from the public inquiry.
Well, of course, the public inquiry has only just started. I think we should allow it to develop a momentum. I don't think it'd be right to put, if you like, an artificial deadline on the public inquiry.
But why has it taken so long? Other countries have finished theirs.
But most importantly, the public inquiry be done thoroughly and be allowed to conduct its business without, if you like, somebody, e.g. the government, putting an artificial deadline in on the end of it.
Right. What do you make of Matt Hancock, the WhatsApp messages that have been released, which seem to conflict with the official advice that was given about testing people, residents going into care homes from the community as well as hospital?
Well, of course, as you know, Joe, my own father died in a care home of COVID. Shortly before the time of these text messages. I don't think the text messages made a difference in his case, but it's a very distressing time for families up and down the country to read about the process behind this. However, I would say Matt Hancock has been clear in saying that the selected text messages do not present the full picture. Like one of the text messages in particular from his special advisor deletes the beginning of the text message, which provides the context for the decision being made.
Which is a meeting
I think
that
this
was held.
is properly a matter for the public inquiry to look at these things.
Do you agree? We should just leave it now for the inquiry.
Well, the defence from Matt Hancock this morning was this is a distorted picture and doesn't tell the full story. The way to get to the bottom of this is through the public inquiry, but they have to get on with it. And I think it's really important that this reports certainly before the next general election, and that there's no attempt to put off the conclusions until after this. That's not an artificial deadline. It's a democratic deadline, and it's very important that it's met.
Let's talk about cost of living, energy bills. Keir Starmer challenged Rishi Sunak about the government maintaining the energy price guarantee at £2,500 because it's going to or the subsidy is going to be reduced in April. Should the government maintain it at £2,500?
Well, we'll have to see, but the intention of the government was clearly, through the course of the winter, particularly cold days, dark nights, that support be there. So, as Rishi Sunak said at Prime Minister's Question Time, that provided £1,000 per household.
Yes.
Half of people's energy bills have been paid
I understand
by
that,
the
but should it be maintained? Otherwise, people are going to be paying more.
Well, I think there's a budget, of course, coming up in exactly 2 weeks' time. We'll have to see what the government does overall to support people at the moment. But it is worth just stressing how much support that the government has provided, in particular over the last year. Half of people's energy bills through the winter, which is just finishing. Energy bills are very, very seasonal. We need to bear that in mind.
Right, but
the most difficult time for people with energy bills has been the time where the government has been meeting half of people's energy bills.
All right, but then Keir Starmer said, well, what about making energy companies pay for the shortfall? Well, what about a windfall tax that will do it rather than taxpayers or bill payers?
As Rishi Sunak said at Prime Minister's Question Time, there's already a windfall tax in place. But secondly, this is the same Labour Party which is also calling on more investment from energy companies in renewables in particular. Now, the same energy companies will be those that are also producing renewables. So Labour have spent the benefits of what they describe as a windfall tax 5 times over and are still expecting those energy companies to invest in more offshore wind, more solar and so on. We've got to make sure energy investment carries on in this country as well as supporting people with their bills.
Pat?
It's nonsense.
Well, it's not.
Which bit is nonsense?
The idea that we spent the money 5 times. The government has introduced a windfall tax that we called for, that they were dragged kicking and screaming to do. They delayed 6 months last year from our call to actually doing it. And there are still holes in it.
Right.
For example, around investment allowances, around the date it kicks in and so on. And to extend the price cap at its current level for a few months could easily be paid for by filling in those holes.
Could it?
Yes, it could. There's an estimate out from Cornwall Energy today saying this would cost around £2 to £3 billion. That would be really important help for people over the next few months, because without that, they're facing an increase of £900 a year from next month on their energy bills.
I'm going to come back to you, Greg. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, Greg, because we said that Peter Barnes from the BBC's Political Research Unit would be looking into claims and counterclaims made. Peter, you've had a look at this issue of a windfall tax or a closing of loopholes of a windfall tax to further subsidise bill payers.
Yeah, that's right. You'll have heard Keir Starmer and just Pat McFadden just then saying there's this, what they call a loophole in the government's current windfall tax. So that windfall tax was introduced last year in May. It effectively sets the tax rate for the profits from North Sea oil and gas extraction at 75%. But there is this investment allowance that companies have, which means that for every pound they invest in North Sea oil and gas, they can take away 91p of their gas bill. And that has led to relatively low take of the tax, particularly from some of the larger companies. So Keir Starmer mentioned Shell. They've reported record profits in 2022 of £32 billion. And Keir Starmer said they're not going to be paying any of the windfall tax. That's not quite right. They originally thought that, but they've revised it. They're going to be paying just over £100 million of windfall tax for 2022. But it's still not a huge amount of money relative to their overall profits. So I guess there is a question for Greg, sorry. Does he think that the windfall tax is currently fair when profits can be that big and yet relatively small amounts being paid by the bigger companies? But there is also a question for Pat that Greg mentioned. What about the investment from these companies? Some of the companies have warned that if the windfall tax was extended as Labour wants to see it, raising more money with a higher rate and without this investment allowance, that could reduce the amount of investment they make.
Well, look, first thing to say is these companies, of course, are taxed more than almost any other company in this country. due to the rates of corporation tax and the windfall tax that the UK government introduced. Second thing I would say is that we're also asking these companies to invest more.
Well, I'll come on to that with Pat, but what about the proportion?
Gas and renewables.
But what about as a proportion of the profits that they have made? Should they pay more, a few £billion more, in order to plug that gap so that the taxpayer and the bill payer doesn't have to?
You've got to be really careful in terms of where is that profit being made, where is it taxable, of course, as well. Like a lot of Shell's profits will not actually be made in the UK. But we've got to be careful. We want Shell and others to invest more in UK gas from the UK continental shelf at the moment. Of course, we're making the transition to net zero by 2050. But for the moment, for our energy security, it makes perfect sense to be getting more gas out of the North Sea and not importing it from abroad.
You will have seen the headlines and the reports over the last few weeks and months from some of these energy companies and oil and gas companies saying that they might hold back on further investment if they are going to have to pay more of a proportion of the profits that they've made, and they are less in the UK than other parts of the world.
There's two things I'd say. First of all, the chief executive of BP said that the windfall tax would make no difference whatsoever to their investment.
But there is a windfall tax.
And he said that a long time ago, actually.
They would go ahead with that.
That was said almost a year ago.
When you look at the figures that were just quoted, the idea that Shell, having made tens of billions of profit, even if it's not all in the UK, is paying as little as £100 million in this tax, when constituents of mine have seen their bills double and they could be facing an increase of £900 next month. That just doesn't fit with people. In an era, these are, in the end, the windfalls of war. That is what these companies are enjoying. It's not through any extra genius or even any extra investment. It's the windfall of war. And our constituents are paying the price for their profits. Now, it is only fair that a proportion of that goes to help people to meet
Well, a proportion, of course, is going to, but you want a bigger proportion.
Well, we want the same proportion to continue for the next few months in terms of its outcome on the price.
Well, but otherwise, how are people going to find that extra money?
Well, look, I think the Labour position is they want more tax and more investment. They cannot have both. The government, under this government, has actually increased the proportion that comes from renewables is up by 5 times since Labour
for investment.
It's actually increased 5 times in renewables.
Don't talk over him.
We need more renewables, but we also, in the short term, need more gas coming out of the UK continental shelf. So we're not importing gas from, e.g., Russia or expensive, quite carbon-intensive liquefied natural gas. That is the priority at the moment. More UK homegrown energy is what the government is focusing on.
Now you can make your point to Greg.
The idea that it's a choice between a windfall tax and investment is not the case because, as you know as well as I do, Greg, the companies are using these profits for share buybacks and dividends much more than they're using them for extra investment. So it's simply not true.
We've taken action on the tax. We took action a long time ago. A lot of what Pat is quoting is from deep into last year. Yeah? The priority is making sure the government, we're paying half of people's energy bills at the moment. 29 billion has gone into that, while still we now have 5 times the investment into renewables than there was under the last Labour government.
The budget's coming up in a few weeks' time. Greg Hand's mentioned that. Do you think there might be a chance for Jeremy Hunt to address this issue?
Yes, possibly. The view in the Treasury, or the message that keeps coming from the Treasury, is there isn't much headroom, we've not got much cash to play with. But this phrase that everything is being kept under review is constantly used by Treasury officials. And I just wonder, Greg, what's the situation for people watching at home that want to have a rough idea what might happen to their energy bills? Are you ruling out extending universal support, or is it still on the table?
Well, look, you're right. There is a budget in exactly 2 weeks' time. People will not have long to wait to see the overall package, as every year, of tax and other levels that will be coming in that budget. What we have said is that we have provided an enormous amount of support through the winter and are still doing so. Yeah. £1,000 per household. A lot of money has been put into those bills and helping people out.
All right.
Particularly during the dark nights and the cold
No, you've
days.
made that clear, but we're wanting to look ahead. Yet, finally.
Can I just say that I think what is likely to happen here is what's happened a few times. We'll be told that what we've been calling for is impossible, outrageous and irresponsible until budget day, and then it's fairly likely that the Chancellor will do it. That's what happened with the windfall tax in the first place. That's what happened with the price cap in the autumn, and it's what may well happen in 2 weeks' time.
Well, and that's your prediction.
Labour. They said there was no money left when Pat was last in government, and nobody is copying that approach.
Right. Us twice on this over the last year.
You have taken on the windfall tax, which was suggested by Labour. Let's talk about housing. We discussed it earlier on in the programme with the former Housing Secretary, Simon Clarke. The government scrapped compulsory housing targets. Critics claim it was under pressure from certain sections of the Conservative Party, and England's new housing supply is predicted to fall to the lowest level in decades, according to a study. Let's have a listen to what Simon Clarke said in the programme earlier.
You know, there is a debate which I am determined to lead and to win, to make sure that my party, which is ultimately the party of opportunity, of building capital in your life, honours that pledge. And actually, there is a whole generation of people, not in their 20s, but in their 30s and 40s, who can't afford to live a decent life because their homes are not fit for purpose, and their rents and their mortgages are totally out of whack with what the type of home that they're getting. Should planning reform be liberalised, Greg?
Well, look, that is something that the government is obviously looking at. Simon makes a very, very strong case, a very, very good case. Yeah. But look at what the government has been delivering. Simon was a brilliant housing minister, a brilliant chief secretary of the Treasury. 3 of the best 4 years in the last 30 for housing starts were in the last 3 years. More affordable housing, as Rishi Sunak outlined at Prime Minister's Question Time. The government's record has been good, particularly in recent years.
It can't be when England's new housing supply is likely to fall to the lowest level in decades. Well, Simon Clarke spoke to me earlier, and he was very, very clear. He said that the Conservative MPs who voted to scrap compulsory housing targets, which he said are absolutely critical to trying to build homes in volume to meet the demand, and particularly to try and increase supply and reduce prices across the country to make it more affordable. He said those MPs were wrong, and he is going to find them. Do you agree with him?
Let's look at what has actually been delivered. That is the most important metric.
No, but I'm asking you a different question. But I'm asking you a different question here.
3 of the best years in the last 30, in the last 4 years, have seen record levels of delivery.
Should there be a liberalisation of planning reform? Should there be compulsory housing targets in every authority across the country?
This is something which, of course, is with Michael Gove at the Department for Housing and Levelling Up in Communities under consideration.
Right. Is there a problem with MPs who block planning applications in their constituencies?
Well, look, in terms of MPs are expected to be their voice in their community. That has long been an issue. I remember the last Labour government had a lot of MPs who would say one thing about their national policy and then a different thing locally.
Well, Greg Hands, that leads me to this tweet. I think it's from 2021. It says the Communities Department has rightly called in Hammersmith and Fulham, that's your constituency council's proposal, to build a new residential tower in central Fulham. We need more homes, but not more tower blocks in Fulham. Simon Clarke, that is talking about you, isn't it? Blocking at a local level what is being proposed at a national level.
No, that very specific proposal was to build a very tall tower block, from memory around 25 storeys, in an area of residential properties in Fulham of typically 2 to 3 storeys, with some other estate properties nearby that were taller, but nothing like as tall as that building. So it's a question also of building housing that is appropriate for that environment.
Right. I mean, it has been a problem of successive governments, so we don't need to trade statistics on that. Labour failed to build enough homes when they were in power. But Keir Starmer has promised that Labour will be the party of home ownership in Britain today. How?
Well, we've got to build more, or people can't buy them. That's a simple
equation. But how are you going to do it? Because MPs, there'll be Labour MPs that also block applications.
I think you can probably find, you will be able to find MPs of both parties who've objected to housing proposals in one way or another in their own areas. But as a government, you have to decide what you want to do nationally on this. And the truth is, there are far too many people who just can't afford to buy a home at the moment, and you have to, in the end, build more homes to try and meet that demand.
Right, so would you like to see a liberalising of planning laws?
I think we're going to have to look at planning to get the housing and the growth that we need, because otherwise the country just doesn't build things quickly enough. So we're going to have to do that. And it will be rocky along the way. But I think at a national level, that's what you've got to do in government policy. And what I was struck by, the furore that happened in the Tory party a couple of months ago was it really illustrated that Rishi Sunak's at the mercy of these rebellions. We had this on housing, we had one on onshore wind, And he can't, of course, stop individual MPs objecting. That will go on, as I say, that's happened across the parties. What he can do as Prime Minister, though, is set the national policy and try to drive it through. And the truth is, he shied away from that, and that's why Simon Clarke is so angry.
Greg?
Well, look, I don't accept that at all. There's a good debate in the Conservative Party. It is not a party that, under Rishi Sunak's leadership, has been beset by rebellions. Yeah, it's working consensually. He's had a very, very good week on the Northern Ireland Protocol with the party, actually showing strong, firm leadership and delivering for the people of the country. That is what Rishi Sunak is all about.
But he capitulated to backbenchers on the housing targets and on onshore wind.
I disagree with that. Onshore wind, of course, has been a long-standing policy going back to 2013 or 2014, in actual fact. So that is not, if you like, a recent change in policy.
Right. Let's talk about your new job. Well, newish anyway. As party chairman, you also have a vice chairman in Lee Anderson. Deputy chairman. How do you get on with him?
Lee and I get on fantastically well. We are a good combination. I've also got other deputy chairmen, like, for example, Nikki Aiken, like, for example, Jack Lepresti, like, for example, Matt Vickers, like, for example, Luke Hall.
All right. I mean, he has caused some controversy, Lee Anderson. We can show you some of the things that he has said. This in the HuffPost, Tory MP Lee Anderson says people use food banks because they can't cook or budget. Let's just show you another one of the things. In fact, we discussed it on the programme. Lee Anderson, new Tory Deputy Chairman, would support return of the death penalty. Do you agree with him on either of those issues?
I don't agree with him on the death penalty, and nor does Rishi Sunak. And, of course, it's government policy to be against the death penalty. But look, for Lee Anderson to say he's in favour of the death penalty, this is not some, if you like, some fringe view. I think probably around a third, 40% of the people of this country believe in the death penalty. This is not something which in any way invalidates him being a Conservative MP or indeed being the Deputy Chairman of the party.
And what about saying people use food banks because they can't cook or budget? Is that the sort of thing that you would subscribe to?
Well, Lee Anderson brings a very real-world experience into the Conservative Party from his own background as a miner and from his community. And I think he is expressing a view in relation to how he sees the world from that perspective. You know, but he and I are very different, but we are both. I'm the Member of Parliament for Chelsea and Fulham. He is the Member of Parliament for Ashfield. We come from a different perspective, but we're all within the broad church of the Conservative Party, which backs Rishi Sunak and Conservative Party policy.
Well, and finally, this in the Daily Telegraph, Calais refugee charities just as bad as people smugglers, says Lee Anderson. Is he wrong?
Well, look, again, I don't agree with that, but I think he's making a point about how the boats and how migration is operating in this country, which is, again, I think, is something which is being debated at the moment. We had it in PMQs just now. The Prime Minister giving a very strong answer in terms of what is going on with the boats and against illegal migration and against people smugglers.
Fair enough. It's a broad church. Lee Anderson is entitled to say what he thinks, and those broad views are being expressed across the Conservative Party.
Everyone's entitled to say what they think, of course, but you know, I can tell you that from my constituency, the people who use food banks really need them. There is a real and growing need. It's a real struggle for people to pay their bills, and particularly when they've got energy bills at the level they are and the level they might go up by, as we've discussed. And there is a real need there. So I disagree with him on his views. It's not a matter of he's not entitled to express them. If that's the current Tory party and that's the representation of it, that's up to them. I would say there's a real need there. And instead of attacking the people who are using the food banks, let's do more to make sure that food banks are not needed.
Is it helpful for the Conservative Party, those sorts of remarks?
I think Lee Anderson is helpful for the Conservative Party. He reaches out to a lot of communities that are important in this country and important the Conservative Party coalition.
Pat, you'll be delighted to know, since you said yourself that there'll be many MPs on both sides of the House objecting to housing, and here is one that you objected to. Is that do you regret it? And is that the sort of thing that has to stop by MPs at a local level if this issue of housing is going to be tackled?
Because there's always a debate. I mean, if you take an area like Wolverhampton that I represent, we have a lot of brownfield land. We've got a lot of former factories. Sadly, they haven't been developed for some decades. My view has always been, yes, we need new housing, but we need it on brownfield first and not the few bits of greenfield that the city has.
But doesn't that just underline that there is always a problem? There's always an issue locally that may be, very well justified in the way that you've done, but that prevents house building.
It can prevent a specific development, but when you've got a national policy, it does mean the local authorities either individually or collectively have to identify the sites and make sure that overall the target is built. That doesn't mean every single development will be right, but it does mean you've got a national policy that drives the number of houses overall that's built, and that's a fair thing to do, and it's right of the government.
Just before we go, Nick, on the Windsor framework, the New Deal, when are we going to hear from the Democratic Unionist Party?
Probably next week at the earliest, but there seems to be quite an active debate happening within the party and a bit more open to it than many people thought.
On that, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. I'll be back with more Politics Live tomorrow at 12:15.